have just one question this morning, and it's this. Why was Middle English used for a scientific treatise at the end of the 14th century? Now, you might say that question no longer needs answering, or it can be answered in just 2 words. Why not? And of course, I accept work over the last decades has shown in all kind of genres, including what you might call hard science, the use of Middle English was much more common than was previously thought. But all of that research by people like Linda Voits, Irma Tavitsainen, and many others has thrown up 2 facts which still require explanation. First, the use of Middle English wasn't consistent across genres. Even though by the mid-15th century it could be used for a learned text just as much as for one we might call popular, it was more likely to be used for medical treatises than, say, for astronomy. The second fact is this. In studies of scientific manuscripts of the late 14th and 15th centuries, the most common option chosen by scribes wasn't Latin or English, but Latin and English. That's one reason I slightly provocatively chose a Latin quotation for the title of a paper about the vernacular. So many writers clearly had a choice. I want to ask how they exercised that choice. Of course, there are examples where code mixing or code switching were probably unconscious or automatic, but let's assume for the moment that wasn't always the case. Given that one fact and one assumption, that the use of Middle English was not uniform and that its users made a choice to use it, it seems reasonable to ask why. The answer will of course depend on many factors, and those factors will vary between manuscripts, writers and audiences at different times and in different places. But I still think the question is worth asking, not just because an answer would tell us about attitudes to language at a time of great ferment in modes of communication, but also because I think, and I hope by the end of this talk you'll agree with me, I think language and content influence each other. The structures and vocabulary of the language you use influence what you can say, and by the same token, what you want to say and how you want to say it, and who you want to say it to, will influence your choice of language. If, as a historian of science, I want to understand how ideas were developed and communicated, and developed in the process of communication, understanding linguistic choice is essential. Now, because the answer we just had to this question was, it depends, and because I only have 15 minutes, I'm going to focus on a single manuscript and see what it can tell us. And it's this one. It's a well-known manuscript. It's securely dated to 1393. That is right in this period when the vernacular began to be used in more and wider contexts, and it's been edited 3 times. The last of these is this digitization program for the Cambridge University Digital Library, and I really encourage you to go and have a look at that if you're interested. It's interesting for a number of reasons. First, as you can see, it's a draft. It's a draft description of how to make and use a planetary Equatorie, an astronomical computing device. It has some neat diagrams of that device, and the bulk of the manuscript is made up of astronomical tables, some directly for use with the Equatorium, and some actually in direct opposition to the use of it. They're all drawn up in or annotated by the hand which wrote the treatise, and as you can see, some of the annotations, or most of the annotations, are in Latin. There are a few in a kind of Middle English cipher, which sadly I don't have time to talk about today. There are also some Latin insertions in the treatise, like this one here. And so this is one of those macaronic manuscripts that were so common in this period. So as I say, this manuscript is quite well known, and this is the reason. In the 1950s, its first editor, Derek de Solla Price, attributed it to Chaucer, and the authorship arguments have raged ever since. I don't have time to go over all those, but suffice it to say that just last year, an article was published which made quite a different attribution. Carrie Ann Rand identified this hand as the same one. This Bodleian Library manuscript contains 2 astronomical treatises by this man, Richard of Wallingford, who was abbot of St Albans, and this ex dono inscription identifies the scribe as John Westwick, a monk of St Albans, and its dependent cell of Tynemouth. So now we know the Equatorie isn't by Chaucer, writing in a secular setting, it's by a monk. So there are lots of questions we need to ask again. One of them is, why did he write his instrument treatise in English? I should say at this point it's a bit problematic for me to say his instrument treatise. There's some evidence it was at least partly translated from Latin, and even some indications of an Arabic influence. But there's also lots of evidence of its originality. So, back to that why question. I'm going to offer 3 possible explanations, 3 Ps. The first we might call principle, the second is pedagogy, the third is practical. Linda Voits and others have used the linguistic concept of domain to explore why English is used in some contexts but not others. And astronomy continued to be a domain in which Latin dominated. It was the language of the universities, the language of logical scholastic thought, the language of the international trade in tables. To an extent, instruments buck that trend, and I'll suggest a reason why in a moment. But even there, English was a minority choice. The treatise closest in content to the Equatorie is a description of this instrument at Merton College, Oxford. That's in Latin. And we just saw Richard of Wallingford. He used Latin for his Albion, which was one of the two treatises John Westwick copied in that Bodleian Library manuscript, and is maybe the second most important instrument treatise written by an Englishman in this period. But there's no question which was the most important. So I'm going to stick with Chaucer for a moment. It seems clear he influenced John Westwick, apart from the fact that Westwick cited him here, and by the way, this note gives Chaucer as the authority for the number of days in 1392 Julian years, which wasn't the kind of number that really needed to be attributed to a particular authority. Apart from that citation, Westwick also names the treatise on the astrolabe explicitly and uses the same terminology as Chaucer in several places. So given Westwick doesn't explain his reasons, I think we can justify looking at Chaucer's reasons for a moment. Firstly, note he admits that Latin is still the default choice for any common instrument treatise. Where is it? Latin, any common treatise. Secondly, note the choice of language has political implications. King Richard was lord of this language. It's also been argued the choice had religious implications. The phrase naked words here is found in Wycliffite tracts in the early 1390s, and it's possible those were an influence. Here, naked words convey an impression of unvarnished clarity, and I think that's at the heart of what Evans and her co-authors down here are getting at in their analysis. But Chaucer also conveys a sense of self-deprecation, and we see the same thing here when Westwick says, I wot well it is figured boisterously. Now where is that? I can't find it, but he says that. It means, I know it's roughly drawn. Somewhere in here. There it is, figured boisterously. I know it's roughly drawn. That diagram's actually perfectly well drawn, but it does give Westwick the opportunity to talk directly to his reader, calling attention to the fact that he drew it. In the same way, as you can see here, he also drew attention to the time and place he was working. Mine Equatorie, 1392 complete, London. I don't want to cement rigid divisions between some universal Latin and historically situated English, but it could be said that English allowed Westwick to make a statement of authorship. On the other hand, I don't want to give the impression that Westwick considered himself in isolation. We've already seen him citing Chaucer, and he name-checks several other astronomers as authorities. So I think Chaucer may be important to us in a third way. I'm not just suggesting that the reasons Chaucer gave for writing in English may be relevant to our understanding of this monk John Westwick, and I'm not just suggesting that Chaucer directly influenced Westwick's choice of language. I'm also suggesting that perhaps Westwick explicitly associated himself with Chaucer's vernacular astronomy as a source of authority. Time to move on to the second P, pedagogy. Here I need to convince you of two things. First, that the Equatorie treatise is pedagogical, and second, that the choice of language makes a difference. I've just got time for two quick examples here. This is the opening sentence of the treatise. Remember, it's instructions for making an instrument. But this isn't just instructive, it's didactic. He doesn't just want his reader to understand how to make a 72-inch equatorium. He wants him to understand why it's 72 inches. The larger you make the instrument, the larger the graduation will be around the rim, and the larger the graduation, the smaller the units you can include. Notice how he addresses the reader directly with thou and thy. He does this throughout the treatise, even for quite abstract things like thy planet or thy moon. I think it's very effective in establishing a relationship with the reader. In the second example, we have clear instruction to carefully nail a metal circle, carefully, subtly, on the rim of the board. But he's given the circle a name, the limb. There's an oral quality to the phrase I cleep, I call, that makes the tone more personal. And he's defined it by an analogy to an object he expects will be familiar to his audience. Elsewhere in the treatise, that's a cartwheel. Here it's an astrolabe. And notice how he repeats the new word, limb, to lodge it in the reader's mind. That's a teaching strategy he uses again and again. Lim, lim, lim. But hold on, I hear you say. Didn't I say the treatise is a draft? Isn't it full of mistakes and crossings out? And don't the tables show the writer learning and practicing different methods? How can he be teaching too? Well, thank you for asking. That brings me back to the title Dum Docent Discunt, learning while teaching. That dictum of Seneca's was well known in this period, and I see no reason why the author couldn't have been learning and teaching at the same time. But would his teaching be any different in Latin? I think it would. In the first place, English was more suited to that oral, personal mode of address I've just noted. Secondly, as Chaucer implied, the naked words of English permit a less technical tone, which sometimes is just clearer. As an illustration, I need to bring in another manuscript. This is a fascinating 15th century compilation at the University of Aberdeen. It contains instructions for making a sundial, first in Latin, and then in the same hand, an incomplete translation into English. To take just one example for now, the very common instruction to draw two perpendicular diameters. Here it is. Protrahe lineam orthogonaliter, draw a line straight up and down. The word orthogonal didn't appear in English until the 16th century. The translator's alternative seems less geometrical and more practical to me. Whether that makes for better pedagogy depends on your goals, and it depends on your audience. Which brings me to the third P, practical. As that example shows, there are times when English is more practical by default, but there are other times when it's more practical by design. Here too, that Aberdeen manuscript gives a neat illustration. Now, if you're familiar with instrument treatises, you'll know they often start with a simple instruction. Draw a circle, divide it with two diameters called AB and CD. That's a very common instruction, but there are many ways to deliver it. Here's what we see in the Aberdeen manuscript. Too many studies in this field describe translation as if it's a completely transparent transfer of material from one language into another. But obviously that's not the case. We saw that with the last example from this manuscript, and we see it again here. The English instruction adds the practical advice to use a compass and notes that size doesn't matter. Yeah, there we are. But it doesn't mention that the centre is E. Now for John Westwick's version. Even less geometrical, even more practical. I've already mentioned the reference to familiar objects. This is almost the same quotation I showed you earlier. Notice also how he instructs the reader to double-check his work. Look, thy cross be true, proved by geometrical conclusion. That's checking it. This is a really practical treatise. It's full of instructions on size, materials, and methods, and in places it even tells you how, if you make a mistake, how to correct it. As a result, it's actually possible to follow the instructions and make a working instrument. That's something that can't be said of all instrument treatises. This version on the left was made for the manuscript's first editor to the size specified by John Westwick. I apologise for the picture of myself, that's just for scale. The one on the top right is one I made myself to show it could be done, and the one at the bottom is a fully functioning virtual model at that website. The practicality of this treatise does make me wonder whether it was written as instructions for a craftsman. Perhaps it was even meant to be read aloud. Of course, there are objections to that. What are the Latin interlineations for? And why would a craftsman need those didactic touches? But I think it's a possibility we should consider. So, to conclude, I've given three kinds of reasons that might explain why John Westwick wrote this treatise in the vernacular. I've used examples to focus on your attention on these principled, pedagogical, and practical reasons, and to suggest that Middle English was a language suited to the author's goals. I've not had time to talk about the way Westwick manipulated the language, coining new terms, borrowing them from Latin and Arabic, and defining them in ways that made them perfectly clear to the reader. But I hope I've said enough to convince you that he used English very purposefully. We now know of many more Middle English manuscripts than we did 20 or 30 years ago. But it doesn't mean we can't gain something from asking why Middle English was used. I hope I've shown you that Latin and English were not necessarily equivalent, and that attention to the choices made by authors and translators can reward us with a deeper understanding of the way that they developed and communicated their ideas. Thank you.